Hello, beautiful community. Tell me if I am audible. Greetings, everybody. Very lovely to have you. Happy Sunday from a sunny London here. How's the audio? Everybody can hear me, or am I silent? Audio is good. Okay. So, I am a little bit more troubled by physical symptoms this moment than I would like to be, but I'm going to do my best in this chat. There's a great aphorist called Georg Christoph Lichtenberg who wrote in the late 1700s, and he once said that he thinks different thoughts depending on whether he is lying down or standing up. And one of the things that I'm so blessed about, and this is just purely luck, is that my sunniness, don't think sunniness is optimism, I'm not politically optimistic, but the sunniness of my personality does not diminish in accordance with what is physically happening to me, and I'm very, very blessed about that. So we'll give this a go, and my heart goes out to any of you who are struggling at the moment physically or indeed even mentally. I want to pick out a couple of questions we started with. Suzanne, that is so kind of you to ask people to like. And I don't know what else you can do. Hi, beautiful Suzanne. Let's start with, I think there's a question I saw early on by Julia. And we'll start with that. Vlad, what is your estimation of how big the influence of all the pro-Ukrainian YouTube channel is? And what are they worth in monetary terms if they were to, do a special synchronized now never event to raise money for Ukraine's counteroffensive? So I think that the key challenge that Ukraine faces is that the West is strongly committed to a Ukraine that's independent and Ukraine that survives this brutal invasion by the Putin regime. But the West is only very partially committed to a Ukrainian victory. And that's a matter of strategy. And that's the key thing that makes a difference. And only different strategic thinking fundamentally helps. Right? Everything else is, important, but much, much less important. I generally do believe in people talking to each other in person or through the internet. I think that's always positive, and it really makes a difference. And even dinner table conversation makes a difference to political issues. But I would not go too far overestimating the significance of pro-Ukraine YouTubers. They're not as significant as those citizens who are skeptical about all of this and are going to be considered sooner or later by their governments as they frame policy toward Ukraine over the next year or two. So I would say I have a positive answer, but it's just like that. The real thing that makes a difference is strategic vision, right? And that's why I've always believed it's so important to talk about what Mr. Putin's project is. And understanding that helps us understand that this is not a war between two countries on the ex-Soviet space. it's an escalation that threatens the security of the whole West. And understanding that our security is at stake means understanding that our support for Ukraine cannot be primarily humanitarian. Jonesy, thank you so much. Life is quite remarkable, isn't it? The easy bits and the hard bits. And some people get a disproportionate balance of these two. And Yulia is also saying, Vlad, all those right-wing wins in Europe scare me even more than international politics. Yeah, I mean, the default, welcome everybody, by the way. We're going to be talking, I think, mostly about the war today. It's beautiful to have all of you with me. The natural default for European politics is right populist authoritarianism. In other words, unless other constructive political forces intervene, that is where the drift is. My strong advice is always not to catastrophize, except of course when it's inevitable, right? I mean, if you're Turkish, you're going to catastrophize the recent political tragedies of democratic deficit in that country. But I always recommend seeing the big pattern, which I describe with this metaphor of our democracies coming out of the bay and going into open ocean. And they're not going to sink just because they're in open ocean, but they are going to be beaten up and battered by the waves. So the negative story is you can forget about the bay. There is no way back there. The positive story is that we can have conversations about how we can make our vessels stronger, more sink proof. And one of the really important things to understand is that democracy and crisis are not incompatible things. Democracy can live in crisis, can sustain itself while being in crisis for a good amount of time, especially if it's democracy in a country like the United States, for instance, or the UK, or Germany, countries where there are very strong institutions. Let's see where we are. Bishop has got a great question. I met a lot of people who try to lessen worries about Russian interference against Europe by pointing to a perceived incompetence of the Russian actors. Is that really responsible? Well, whether it's responsible or not depends on the motivation behind it. But it's very important to understand that Russian interference is overwhelmingly incompetent. I mean, there's very few bits of Russian state machinery that are competent. The one I can think of is, I suppose, at least in part, the economic branch of the government. Russia's economic policy is run in a way that is comparable to a modern Western state in competence levels, at least to some extent. But then the rest of the Russian state is apocalyptically incompetent, and it's very important to not jump from the one generalization to the other, whichever way you want to travel. So you don't want to say, well, Russian economic policy is competent, therefore the FSB is competent. It doesn't follow. It's completely possible and indeed true that the FSB is bewilderingly incompetent, even though there are competent people running Russia's economy. And you also don't want to go the other way, right? Because 749,000 YouTubers came out and said Russia's economy is going to collapse, it's going to collapse, it's going to collapse. None of them really knew anything about the Russian economy, but they said that because or partly they said that for views, but partly they said that because It's tempting to think that just because 4 out of 5 uh, bits of the regime are incompetent, this one is incompetent too. Now, so the interference is incompetent. I mean, the interference in 2016 in the US election was wildly incompetent, but it doesn't need to be competent to make some kind of a difference. So I don't think the question of competence is what allows us to say, that we should worry about it or not worry about it to some extent, some particular extent. I think what it's really about is understanding the significance of the impact. And one of the things I always say is that probably the most important point of Russian interference is not that the interference itself does damage to us, but that it sends us into a loopy loop of thinking about the interference, worrying about the interference, and changing our behavior accordingly, and forgetting to take care of our garden, as it were, forgetting to take care of um, the kind of basic issues of sustenance that our democracy needs us to attend to. So, if we look at most Russian attempts to interfere in Western democracies, I think that the impact has been small. And the the impact of the interference itself, the bigger impact has come from us panicking about the interference. So we've got to be very clear. We've got to acknowledge that it's real. We've got to acknowledge in each case what it is. But we also should not sort of russiagate ourselves into oblivion unnecessarily. And the real danger here is that we jump on Russian interference as a primary cause of our pathologies and our conflicts at home in our democracies, and it's not. And the United States has badly fallen into this pathology, and Britain with Brexit has fallen into this pathology. Um, that you could imagine a kind of a 0.5% impact of Russian interference. That might be too great even, but we've talked about it as though it was a 50% impact. At least some of us on some platforms. And that's done enormous damage at the level of making us think that domestic challenges we face are products of malign foreign interference. That is a very destructive path to go down. So, as always, you've got to balance two thoughts in mind. I mean, there's the sort of, uh, folks who've bought Kremlin propaganda who say the interference isn't real, and it is real, but we've also got to see it as it is, not less than it is and not more than it is in each case. So that's my answer. Let's have a look. Armand is on our stream for the first time. Great to have you. Let's have a look where we are. Edmuth is asking, should we be more concerned with what some Western politicians have learned from Russian propaganda? I would say it's not that they're learning from Russian propaganda. It's that there's an organicity to the way certain modes of political operation spread and globalize. So it's not that we have learned from Russian propaganda, it's that um, certain patterns of political conduct, especially if they're a product of cultural trends that are global or a product of technological trends that are global, like social media in its current shape. These methods of operating disperse. It's not that Western post-truth populists have learned from 1990s Russia or even from the Putin regime. It's that these things have a way of going around the globe. They have a kind of virality. So um, And that virality is very interesting to reflect upon because you're talking about here Western politicians learning tricks from Russian propaganda, destructive tricks. But the truth is that as these dodgy methods of operating globalize, a lot of politicians begin practicing them without even realizing that they're doing it. I mean, a lot of politicians are becoming post truth politicians without being consciously post truth, for example. Right. And so, what's the distinction between post truth politicians and liar politicians? Liar politicians make up particular untruths. Post truth politicians destabilize the relationship between truth and falsehood itself. So, if we take an example, the liar will say, I wasn't there last week, even though the truth is that I was. But the post truth politician will say, many people have talked about where I was, and I've had many perfect conversations about this, and some people say I was there, but other people say it wasn't. And I'm going to tell you exactly where I was, although nothing is so clear, and so on. So you see what I mean? That there's a difference. There's a difference here. Um, this is no longer lying. This is giving 3 or 4 incompatible messages on the same issue, let's say across a week. And that has a much more distinctly corrosive uh, relationship with truthfulness, to which liberal democracies have to remain tethered if they're to endure. Gerald is asking, Vlad, you mentioned once something about the magic of adulthood. Could you elaborate on that? The cynic in me would understand adulthood as a balance between aspiration and constraints. I might talk about this more on the small philosophy channel. What I would say is that magic does not disappear from your life as you become an adult. Um, Different kinds of magic become available, in fact. Um, and they are probably more magical in some ways than the magical things of childhood. And it's a fascinating conversation to have. And I promise I will have it. I'll probably title it something like that on the philosophy channel. For example, there are certain kinds of freedom that human beings can achieve. I'm not talking about political freedom, which you can only achieve as a kind of self-transparent adult, right? So um, we must not think that being a grown-up is um, about compromise and realism and the uh, a sort of abandonment of magical simplicities. There is also the magical simplicity of adulthood. It's not the simplicity of children. It's rather the simplicity that has gone through complexity and come back out on the other side. I'm deliberately not being specific because we're going to talk about this more. Papa, great to have you. Um, do we have free will as a question for the philosophy channel? We have as much free will as we need, is the answer. Um, has your I'm going to take a quick personal question, if that's okay. Has your physical health ever affected you mentally? If so, are there any pieces of philosophical literature that help you in those times? So, because I'm a professional philosopher, philosophy is not therapeutic for me. Philosophy puts more pressure on my mental health. It does not improve my mental health because it makes radical requirements upon one's capacity to question everything, including things that you're very engaged with and very committed to. So philosophy is anti-therapeutic. But because I'm a professional at it, I'm always very safe. I'm never going to go uh, too far and endanger myself psychologically. So the professional philosopher takes very calculated risks. um, you go into zones of danger, of course, but you're wearing helmets, seat belts, lots of various security features. Um, so, like that. In terms of my mental health, I've been extraordinarily lucky to have been all my life spectacularly um, incapable of having depressive thoughts, and I don't have anxiety. Um, that doesn't mean that there weren't issues I needed to work on to become free, but I think that I've been, and I consider this a matter of luck and not an achievement, extraordinarily lucky to have great stability and joy. So I would say that the answer to that is no. It hasn't affected my mental health. Being physically ill hasn't affected my mental health. But of course, when I was a 22-year-old kid and I got sick and I was a postgrad student 20 years ago, I was terrified. I mean, the 22-year-old kid who can't walk, can't read, can't really speak, that level of brain inflammation. So I was terrified, but I beyond that, I managed to avoid anxiety or depression in particular. So I'm very lucky about how amazing it feels to be in my head. Patrick is asking which modern dictator is a role model for Putin. Putin's role models are all historical figures, and they're figures that he rather idealizes into shapes they never truly had in reality. And that can be Catherine the Great, Alex III. Um, there's a video on the main channel about Putin's fancy for Alexander III, and sometimes Peter the Great. Um, he's not a great fan of the 20th century. He's allergic to Lenin and is has mixed feelings about Stalin. He's probably more privately critical of Stalin, but he doesn't want to go there, especially now when he's beginning to resemble him increasingly. Olena, great to have you. Thank you for your words. Let's see. If the Russian Federation collapses, would the regional people seek help from the West to establish themselves? Sure. Will China try to capitalize on that? Sure. But don't over romanticize this. Don't think that Russia's broken down into ethnic groups that are craving independence. They're not. Um, there is certainly a colonial legacy that Russia needs to reckon with that includes different ethnic groups, absolutely, there in Russia. And we need to see how that process goes. But let's it's important to not take a postcard picture of this and realize that whatever happens is going to be a product of a political process internal to that country. hope for the Russian population to become more political. So there is hope for the Russian population to become more political, but as ever, there's also a risk of them becoming political along totalitarian lines. I remain skeptical about that, but the risk is a kind of fascization where they come together with the regime to some extent. Funky Fudge is asking if Putin has a plan for succession. Putin does not have a plan for succession, and it would destabilize his regime in his view if he had. And Putin is now, this is the correct political analysis, Putin is too weak to secure a succession process. Um, if he were going to do a succession process that he prescribed, he needed to put it into place much earlier. He is now too weak to secure what happens at the end of his reign. Olena, thank you so much. Damien, thank you. I didn't see a question, Damien. Hello, Neil. Scrum is asking, hello, Vlad, where do you think we should stand on the gradient between being a cheerleader and being objective in our echo chamber-esque circles? My advice is try to not make your views about Ukraine pathological. That's my answer. So one of the pathologies I've recently described is the gamification of war, whereby we relate to political reality, which isn't a game, as though it were a game to which we need to work out the rules. There's quite a lot of war gamification going on. And it's not necessarily harmful, but it means that your relationship with Ukraine is no longer about Ukraine, it's about a game. Right? Watch for patterns like that. And then I would say, stick to high integrity content and stick to high integrity content providers, and pluralize the content you consume as much as possible. There's a lot of grift in the pro-Ukraine world. There's a lot of people entrepreneurially exploiting the issue. Funnily enough, sometimes that's good because they happen to be on the right cause. They'd be on another cause if it came up. But be aware of that. And then be aware of perspectives that are toxic. Now, let you work out what that means, or which specialize in looking around for a round of applause for themselves. But both analysis and activism have a place, and it's okay to engage with just the one or just the other or both. So don't beat yourself up, but try to make sure that your relationship is not pathological, and in particular that you're not working out, you know, challenges inside you, inside your life, in terms of this issue. So try to be as clean as you can in how you relate to this. Stephen, wishing you health. Yes, it's an extraordinary thing. You know, having a little one in the middle of having ME. So what you're going through is very beautiful. and very scary at the same time. Let's have a look. Alison, thank you so much for your generosity. Red Gizmo, shout out back to you in Aussie land. Nixie, hi. I may have uh, I may have missed that story. Sorry, Stephen. Yeah, much love. Good luck, Anya. Great that you popped in. Michael Parks, why did you leave Israel? So I didn't. I was still a child at that point. I was just coming into my teens, I think. Um, so what happened was that at the end of the Soviet period, a lot of people wanted to escape, and one of the most accessible avenues, one of the few accessible avenues, if not the only one, was Israel. And that means a lot of people went to Israel because they could, not because they wanted to go to Israel. And a lot of people were not necessarily Jewish enough, let me put it like this, but they made it work out. And so a lot of people, having got to Israel, didn't love it and wanted to move on wherever they could. And in fact, if they could go straight away to whatever destination that they dreamed about next from the Soviet Union, they would have done just that. So what I would say is that that was a massive immigration, a huge experiment in blood and belonging. It was very moving to be part of it. Extraordinary to come out of the communist bloc into the West overnight. But in many ways, that experiment didn't work. First of all, because imagine having hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people move into your country when you've population of 4 million at the time. So it was challenging for Israelis. Russians often ended up, feeling that they couldn't quite regain the kind of status they had back in the Soviet Union. They couldn't work in equivalently good jobs and so on. And that Russian voting demographic now in Israel tilted Israel to the right because these Russians preponderantly voted for Likud, the right wing party. So it was also an exacerbation of the Palestinian tragedy, too. Roberto is asking a philosophical question, which I can't answer in detail. Libertarianism has nothing to do with free will. Free will has nothing to do with politics. It's not a political position. I'm not a compatibilist, and most people don't know what determinism is. Most people think that determinism means the recognition that we live in something like a causal universe and that nothing can be in the world unless it's part of the causal universe. They think that that is a deterministic answer to the problem of free will. It isn't. It's just a statement of one of the components of the problem itself, right? So to admit that isn't to say that you're a determinist. It's to simply begin describing the problem of free will. The problem of free will fundamentally is um, let me say something sociological briefly about it, just to explain this. After saying something philosophical, the problem of free will is here is the picture the world physics gives us. That picture is right. Um, Whether it's right because it describes the world as it is, or whether it's right because it's the best we've got, doesn't matter, but there is the way the physics describes the world, our best naturalistic understanding of the world. And there are two more categories. A category of concepts to do with human action, and then a category of concepts to do with ethics. And the problem of free will is physics compatible with our concepts um, around human action? And is physics compatible with our ethical concepts? My view is that physics is compatible with all concepts about human action, like intention and deliberation. And my view is that physics is not compatible with all of our ethical concepts, but it's compatible with the ones that we need. That's the cartoonish answer. We'll talk about it more. The sociological point is that virtually nobody understands what the problem of free will is because it's taken a pop common currency, and people have debates about it without even grasping what the issue is. And for a lot of people, their view on free will is a reflection of their sort of self-respect as folks who are informed or intellectually sophisticated, and people get very competitive about their views of free will. But there's virtually no other issue about which folks are more engaged and more competitive with as little understanding of what the problem actually is. I'll be saying more. Sorry to do philosophy with you guys. No more free will talk, by the way, because we'll get lost. Jan, do you know about the philosophy channel? We're going to make some videos there. There's a few videos there already, but they're very much public philosophy. I'm also going to share some professional philosophy content there soon. Caro, thank you. Be nice, or you're going on a timeout? Jessica, thank you. Jessen Yin. You've DM'd me. Great. I'll have a look. I'm slow. I'm slow. Yes, there's gonna be more philosophy. I wanted to have a sort of a public philosophy type chat with you, some of you, on the philosophy channel about death. That's gonna be next. Really lovely topic. Skulls ain't dead. If anti-protest laws weren't in place, do you think far more Russians would be openly anti-war and even critical of Putin? I think that the thing that you have to consider isn't that the anti protest laws are in place, it's how long they've been in place. Um, so, and they've gone together with control over the information environment. They've gone together with an extraordinary kind of stoking of the population into a mood of revanchist resentment. They've gone with a project of trying to atomize the population and keep them from working together on political projects. They've gone with, a quarter of a century long attempt to tell the population that nothing is true, that yes, the propaganda we are pumping at you is probably probably um, not representative of reality, but then nothing anybody else says is either. So when you put all of that toxicity and political calamity together, you get to where you are now. So um, if Putin disappeared tomorrow, things would change, but the legacy of all of that wouldn't just wouldn't go in overnight. The other thing to say is there's a very big generational divide. And what you've roughly got is a situation where there's a very big gap between young people. I mean, there are millions of people, young people in Russia, who find the NATO issue, for example, alien. Um, so, NATO expel, who cares about NATO expel? They're expanding, great. Can we join or we can't? Well, let them expand anyway. What's the deal? What do you mean you're invading? You're invading our neighbor. How does that make any sense? Have you completely lost your mind? There's a lot of young people who think that. And then there's an older generation that thinks very, very differently indeed. And what the Putin regime has successfully done is got the people in the middle to asphyxiate what is probably a tendency to join in with the younger folks. Um, and with the older generation, there isn't a solution until they go, basically. So that's a little bit of a song and a dance around this question of what would happen if people could protest. But if there could be a magical wand, just wave for one day, it's kind of inconceivable, of course, under the Putin regime. Then, yeah, of course, more people would come out because um, it wouldn't lead potentially to you losing your work or your education or your capacity to travel or use the banking system and so on. Oh, there was a question from Schofield early on. Um, I'm going to answer half of it. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to take Crimea back and whether the nuclear power plant will be weaponized? Let me just take Crimea. So the trouble with Crimea is that part of Ukraine's thinking is that threatening Crimea is going to destabilize the Putin regime. I mean, that means we've got to ask the question, even if Ukraine were to break Russia's land bridge to Crimea and make Crimea directly vulnerable, even if that were to happen, would that destabilize the Putin regime? What if Ukraine conducted extensive bombardment of Crimea? What if Ukraine looked like it was on the verge of entering Crimea? Would that destabilize the Putin regime? Well, let's go further. What if Ukraine just took Crimea? Would that rock, um, in a really existential way, the Putin regime? My answer to that is yes, but there aren't guarantees. So it's not necessarily likely, but there's a conceivable scenario whereby Ukraine takes Crimea, but the war isn't over because Russia continues to bombard Ukraine while preparing for a second Ukrainian war in 2028 to retake Crimea. So if Ukraine took Crimea now, um, we would need to ask good questions about why Russia couldn't take it back 5 years later. And if the Putin regime is in power, it would try if it felt it had a chance. So that's some of the difficulty that we're facing here. And what this difficulty is really about is that Ukraine is stuck with a very ambitious theory of victory. And that theory is make Crimea vulnerable, um, and hopefully wait until that causes the Putin regime to rock. Um, so it's a very ambitious theory of victory that involves regime change. And without regime change in Russia, it's not clear that the war can end. At least it's not clear that the war can end without leading to a situation where the Russians try to replay the war soon, as soon as they can. So these are some of my difficult thoughts. I'm going to say more about this in the next video on the main channel. I've just realized for health reasons, we've got a month without a video in the main channel, and we have to change that. Mukid, when I say that the Russian immigration to Israel failed, what I mean is that it failed as the extraordinary and ambitious experiment in blood and belonging that it described itself as. So we've got a Russia fancier here, Mr. Disinformation Project. Let's have a look at what he says. Putin has 70% approval compared to a Western government with 35% approval. Russia will not lose, their economy is doing well. Well, Russia's economy is certainly not at risk of some kind of catastrophic collapse, but it's not doing well. It's not doing well at all. But it has a level of stability, and Russia has a capacity for months, if not years to come, possibly years, to continue a low-level war. In terms of Putin's approval ratings, the way that kind of regime works is that they've got a sort of monarch at the top, and that monarch has to give the impression that the people are with him. And there are various kinds of techniques that are used to generate that impression. Um, some of them are elections, others are actually polls that are publicly available. Um, and in a certain sense, that means that even polls that aren't uh, controlled by the regime, as it were, aren't orchestrated by the regime, can, or at least always risk, sort of servicing this need for the regime to, bring it about that there's a perception that the people are with the leader. But that's a kind of an effect achieved against the background of what is genuinely deep and profound depoliticization, um, whereby the impression of support is more important than the reality of support. In terms of where Russians really fit, I think um, with the war, certainly, there's a kind of a 20% for, 20% against, and a depoliticized blob in the middle. And that depoliticized blob does tend to outsource politics to Putin, but that is a kind of act of um, retreat into the private sphere and a rebellious kind of retreat. It's not an expression of support in anything like the sense that we would think of it if we talked about support for politicians in Western countries. So these are not well expressed thoughts, but some thoughts about how that regime works. Caroline, I don't fully understand your question. What does taking crimes? Can Ukraine win without taking crimes? I don't understand what that means. Yeah, we've got a little bit of a Vatnik situation. We rarely have a Vatnik situation in the comments. We have a little bit of a Vatnik situation. Let's see where we're at. Are Russians more disaffected politically, economically, or socially? I don't know what it means to separate the two, but what I would say is that there's a grave crisis of political agency in Russia. Um, and it, it's going to take a lot to overcome that. Really, really a lot. And when you look at the Russian resistance to the truth about what is going on in Ukraine, we have to understand that not as ignorance, but as indeed resistance. Because accepting what is going on in Ukraine would be a grave attack on the way Russians think of their political agency. So what the role of the Russian opposition is to persuade Russians that there is a way to acknowledge what's going on with the war and to acknowledge what's going on with the Putin regime without, in the process, feeling like they're asphyxiating themselves as political agents. Right? We'll be talking about this more when we talk about depoliticization. So I just saw a question about the news today and Mr. Navalny's protests. Let's have a look. Verti, thank you so much. Caroline, I'm so sorry I misread your question. Obviously, you meant Crimea. Let's see if I can find it again. Can Ukraine win without taking Crimea? If by victory you mean guaranteeing Ukraine's security, Ukraine can't even win by taking Crimea necessarily, as I've just said. So this is the problem. I mean, Mr. Putin is locked into this war, and it doesn't end until Mr. Putin is gone, I'm afraid to say. Now, would Ukraine be in a much more strong position if it could take Crimea? Yeah, absolutely. absolutely. Um, but even if Ukraine retakes all of its territories, that gives us a good chance, the best chance of um, the war being over. But even that's not guaranteed. So I would say yes, Crimea is enormously significant. Mm. Taking Crimea is the single biggest thing that Ukraine could do to bring the war to an end, even though even that wouldn't guarantee the war ending. That's how I'd put it. Um, let's have a look. Ilya is asking, what do I think about the protest in the name of Navalny today? I think it's a really good idea for Russians to come out and protest in the West. So there's no doubt about that, and that hasn't been happening enough. And part of the reason it's not been happening is that it's not clear who's who in the Russian opposition. It's not clear who is in charge. And it's not clear to what extent all the different bits of the Russian oppositional groups can speak in a single voice on anything. They're trying to fix that now, of course, as you would know. Um, we'll see how that goes. The other thing is that when we talk about Russian opposition, we think that we're talking about politicians, but we're not. There are very few, almost no politicians in the Russian opposition. There are advocates, there are researchers and investigators, for example, in Mr. Navalny's organization. There are broadcasters and YouTubers, um, but I'm not quite sure they're politicians. Somebody who is a politician is Mr. Navalny. And it's been a huge um, loss for anybody who wants the Russian space politicized. I think that he has been in prison. I think now we can conclude that he would have made more of a difference from outside. But he would still potentially argue that his route to power in Russia, insofar as he has one, probably goes through being in Russia and being in jail. But Mr. Navalny is a politician. He is somebody who politicizes things. You may hate him, you may be neutral about him, you may like him, but the point is he politicizes the Russian space. He's not sitting there giving moral lessons about who is terrible and who we should despise the most and who is the most ethically disgraceful and who is a war criminal. He gets Russians to begin thinking about taking steps toward an alternative, and he has a talent for um, uh, activating people, even under some circumstances that are really unfavorable toward any political action. So that's Navalny. Like him or not, he's actually a politician, right? He's a political actor. In terms of the protests today, I think he's got criticized by some people ethically for inviting Russians to come out in Russia. I actually think that they seem to be quite careful about what they were saying. They were saying, if you want to be a hero, come out, but you don't have to. That tended to be the message. And if now and over the next year or two, Mr. Navalny lands a lot of Russians in jail for protesting, for instance, then we will judge him ethically, and history will judge him depending on what happens later on. If Mr. Navalny gets a lot of Russians to lose their livelihoods or lose their freedom over the next couple of years by sending them into impossible situations, but then he comes out and plays a fundamental role in the abolition of imperialist authoritarianism on the ex-Soviet space, then we might see that it was worth it. But if he's unlucky and he can't do that, then his ethical evaluation will be different. This is a matter of Navalny's ethical lack to some extent. And then, in terms of bringing people out in Russia as an effective act, um, I think that it's not effective politically beyond showing people that they're not alone, right? Um, but the political downside beyond personal consequences of going out is that you want people who are ready to protest to be free to protest when protesting is going to make a real difference and taking action is going to make a real difference. What you don't want is, 7 or 11 little protests that are bound to make zero imprint, but along the line of them happening, lots of people lose their freedom, and then you don't have that base of people to propel forward when there's a crack in the regime and there's genuinely space to act. So this is the debate in the Russian opposition now. That do you recommend people go out and protest, or do you actually keep them back? But in reality, it seems to me that really very few people are going to come out in Russia. We're going to see what it looks like. So I would say I'm skeptical about Mr. Navalny's asking Russians to come out and protest, but in the end, uh, he's going to be judged on all of that in some years when we have an outcome or a lack of an outcome. Olena, thank you so much for sharing about your grandma who's had ME since she was 25. There's a lower life expectancy with ME, so it's wonderful that she's 77. And thank you so much for wishing me long years of life. And I'm wishing health to you and to your grandma. And it's my great pleasure to talk about politics in Eastern Europe with all of us here. Tom is asking, would it be morally justified to assassinate Putin? It would not be politically effective, probably. So there is no moral justification there that's going to be prior to political considerations. If you do something that is politically counterproductive, that is going to be a morally bad act. You see, you can't separate political efficacy from ethical evaluation. It's fascinating. This phenomena of folks who are outside ghastly regimes living in the West, but are very critical of the West and fantasize about their ghastly regime while enjoying in the West the benefit of having all these things that regime precisely doesn't give one. Um, I think that pathologies of post-truth and distrust in our politics help create an environment for that. And we can't underestimate how far people are in little bubbles. Sort of 15 plus years ago, when I was doing a quarter time PhD, for a while, I shared an accommodation with um, a nice young man from Syria who was left, right, and center just buying Syrian propaganda and was not able to snap out of Syrian government propaganda um, in many of his views, even though he was in the UK. HMS is asking, do you agree that dictators tend to fall suddenly and without warning? I think the lack of transparency of these kinds of regimes means that we often do get surprised. Yeah. So the Putin regime is the kind of regime that could potentially fall quickly. But my assessment is to be skeptical about that today. No, I don't think the West would necessarily see a rapid regime change in Russia coming. Mike is asking if Russia lost the war, what percentage of the current Putin regime would regain power? So probably a lot, but not the top people. But even that's in question. It could be some of the top people. What we should let go of, even if Russia were to take a more democratic path, is the idea that Mr. Khodorkovsky and Mr. Kasparov are going to engineer their own um, preferred agents to come in and take over. Not at all. There could be people sitting at the same table um, who had the relationship of imprisoned and imprisoner. I am drinking some kind of juice with lime and charcoal. Repeat post. Um, Greetings from Singapore. Hi, Tails Orange. What do you think about authoritarian governments seeking the interests of its own citizens and seeking the betterment of its own society? Um, so I don't think that a government needs to be a liberal democracy to have some basis, some sound basis of legitimacy. And I think that a government can meet a lot of its citizens' needs while being authoritarian. But there are different kinds of authoritarianism, and some are much more toxic than others. Um, but I would say that just being in the modern world, being in 2023, means that it's hard to picture a sound and legitimate regime that doesn't have some elements, some strong elements of participatory democracy. So I don't think it's ever good to have a rigged court system. It just isn't. And I don't think it's ever good to have a situation where you cannot vote out the people in power. And so you see the more ticks of that kind we put, the closer we move to something we would call a liberal democracy. And it's a question of, uh, how far will we go in that direction? And I want to be careful. I don't want to equate all kinds of regimes that are less democratic. Um, so there are absolutely levels there, and there are differences there. CK, is the media being irresponsible with its predictions and messaging about the Ukraine's counteroffensive? I worry about public support dropping should the counteroffensive fall. Um, you um, should worry about support falling if the counteroffensive doesn't work. Well, doesn't exceed expectations. I think the truth is that it needs to go very well for a big commitment to Ukraine to be sustained. That's that's my sense. Now, some of the discourse politics about the counteroffensive is intentional and is part of Ukraine's informational warfare. So, in the end, this will be borne out by what happens on the battlefield. I think in terms of, what's responsible, what's irresponsible of us, what I believe in terms of a healthy approach to this, is that we talk about our commitment to Ukraine, whatever happens with the counteroffensive, and we talk about it not necessarily being the last counteroffensive through which we need to support Ukraine. So that's my recommendation about where the conversation partly needs to go. Um, but no, I wouldn't freak out about some platforms sort of bigging the counteroffensive up uh, in a way that's not continuous with what military experts think. And military experts are conservative about what Ukraine can do, but they're also uncertain. They're also uncertain. So there may not be a conflict in the end between people who are jumping up and down very optimistically and military experts who are expressing conservative views. So, um, but there is nothing magical we can do to stop public support dropping if the counteroffensive only yields modest results. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that the West is committed to Ukraine's survival and independence, but our commitment to more than that, to a full Ukrainian victory, is bitty and partial and not properly there, in fact. Um, so, inevitably, uh, that means that if the counteroffensive doesn't go well, um, our commitment to Ukraine's independence won't drop, but our commitment to Ukrainian victory may drop. I think that's how I would put it. Alphonse says, "Do you want to DM me because I'm not informed enough to answer your question? If you DM me with a quick description, then I could give you a quick answer of my sort of sense." Yes, of course, I do think Belgrade, Dr. B, Belgrade will replicate. There is no doubt about that. The war will come onto Russian soil in all kinds of ways we can barely imagine now, I'm afraid to say. And, part of the reason that the Russians have been playing down the drone attack on Moscow so much is that they think there's going to be many bigger ones. Christopher is saying that HMM has nothing to contribute to the chat. Yeah, I've noticed a couple of the comments. I didn't see anything bannable though. Till Juice, I think Russian soldiers will run away when they see Western vehicles and tanks. They won't run away, but is there a risk of a catastrophic collapse of morale? Yeah, because these soldiers still don't know what on earth they're doing in Ukraine, and increasingly, with this dissolution of monopoly of organized violence, um, uh, you know, they don't know who they're fighting for necessarily. Even am I fighting for the Ministry of Defense? But then Mr. Prigozhin says the Ministry of Defense is useless. Mr. Putin seems to be keeping Mr. Prigozhin. Um, so there could be a catastrophic collapse of morale in the Russian military. Trey Alexatos, I don't think that's true anymore. You don't think what's true anymore? Jan, in what context could this war uh, be a reason for postponing climate change mitigation measures and other policies which can lower urgencies, rising worldwide tensions? This war will have a mixed effect on climate policy. It will get Europe off fossil fuels a little bit more quickly. In some ways, it is a war on climate policy, but the question is to what extent. And one academic, Alexander Etkin, makes a very provocative argument that one of the primary reasons for the war is to um, one of the primary reasons for the war is to obstruct the West's climate policy so that um, the world doesn't move away from being dependent on the resources that Russia's economy is dependent on selling. Dre Alexatos is saying it's not true about Russian morale. Yes, it is true about Russian morale. Russian morale is not just catastrophically low in the military, it's becoming lower and lower. Kyle, hi in Wales. I haven't been to Wales in so long. If Russia wins the war, what will it mean for the West? Russia will not win the war in the long term. Russia can just protract its defeat because Russia is in a catastrophic imperial self-immolation. and it can only protract that. Petrus is saying, what if Russia decided to bring the war, if Ukraine decided to bring the war far deeper into Russian territory with a multitude of sabotage missions all over Russian territory? It's doing that, and it'll do that much, much more. So the answer is that's inevitable. Pillow is asking a question that doesn't quite make sense to me. Do you think the broader Russian people's mentalities are more similar to the UK or the EU? Um, the gap between UK and European mentality is, well, there's no European mentality except for some generalizations. So that gap between the EU and UK, if there is one, is too small to meaningfully ask what is Russia closer to, because Russia is at a quite a significant cultural distance from France and the UK. The gap between France and the UK is big, but it's quite small compared to the cultural gap between France, UK on the one hand together and Russia on the other hand. But having said that, the cultural gap between France, UK and Russia is smaller than the cultural gap between France, UK and China. And also make a distinction in our let's make a distinction in our heads between a different culture and a screwed up culture, right? A lot of what we're seeing in Russia are extreme states of screwed upness. So, for example, we're seeing some global pathologies of depoliticization, for example, dramatically expressed in Russia. So, to what extent does it make sense to call that Russian culture? Well, it only makes sense insofar as there were longer run cultural patterns in Russia, stretching decades or a century or two, that made that depoliticization crisis, for example, m- more likely or deeper. Are there such cultural elements? Yeah, there are. But is being extremely and catastrophically depoliticized distinctively Russian? No, it's not. It's a cultural disaster that Russia is experiencing. So we got to some extent try to distinguish between what's a culture that's different, what's a culture that's gone wrong. Uh yes, let's have a look. J. Smith Jones is asking, at what point will NATO allow Ukraine to join, or is Article 5 too big of a deterrent? Um, there's a real problem because NATO won't, as things currently stand, allow Ukraine to join unless Ukraine's at peace. But Ukraine may not be at peace as long as the Putin regime is in power. So that creates a kind of paradox. Because even if Putin loses Crimea, he'll still fire weapons. If he doesn't lose power, he'll still fire weapons into Ukrainian territory. So that creates a problem. Um, Article 5 is a very good deterrent, but Mr. Putin thinks that Western decline will lead to a situation where Article 5 can be tested and shown to fail. So this is sort of Putin's vision of, I don't know, invading Eastern Estonia in 2030. Luca is asking about Russia's ambitions towards Central Asian states. Um, the truth is that at the moment, Russia is too weak for any of this. These questions would only become significant if Russia could somehow reconstitute, if Russia was allowed to reconstitute. And then we could talk about potentially other countries being threatened by Russia that aren't just Ukraine, or Ukraine and Moldova, but we're not there, and we will try to avoid getting there. And one good way to try to avoid getting there is to support Ukraine toward a victory. Um, I think you need a different kind of expertise to mine to answer whether an attack on the Baltic states would 100% have triggered the response. Now it certainly would, without any doubt. Um, would it have triggered the response if Putin attacked the Baltics instead of Ukraine? I don't know. Um, but I think it's more likely that it would have done than 10 years from now if some of these patterns of democratic decline we've been discussing materialize. Um, no, Mikhail is asking, do I think that there are any signs that Putin and the Kremlin leadership have moderated their belief that the West is in such a decline as to not prompt an Article 5 response? No. There is a dogmatic belief in the Kremlin that the West's decline is imminent and irreversible, and that once that happens, so long as Russia is strong enough, um, uh, they can have a go. Alphonsas is asking, what are the chances of a Russian military attack into the Baltics until 2030? Um, well, we hope they're low. But the truth is that if this war freezes, and if the Russian economy is stable enough, and Russian society is militarized, and Russia takes a series of totalitarian turns, stabilizing the Putin regime, Russia will want to reactivate either this war or a conflict with the West in some other way. So the question is, um, from the Kremlin's point of view, not even about if, but when. So Mr. Putin still has a proprietorial relationship, not just to the Baltics, but to pretty much all of Eastern Europe. And he thinks it's only capacity or sort of bad historical luck that is keeping him from acting on that. So I want to say that the chances of Russia invading the Baltics in 2030 by 2030 are low, but they're not zero. And they're not low because Mr. Putin doesn't want to give it a try. He does, and he does want to challenge Article 5. But he thinks you can't challenge Article 5 until the West is weak enough, and it's far too strong now in his view, but it will decline. That's Putin's position. Rebus, great to have you. Alina, Vlad, what do you think about Patrushev? Does he really believe? Oh, I think he does believe in what he says. He recently predicted the fall of the US from the Yellowstone volcano eruption. So I do think that Patrushev's um, conspiratorial fantasies are real. He's probably lying here and there, but I think he tendentiously tends to um, be compelled by some of these things he pronounces, more so than Putin is himself. Putin would be more interested in in the more general structure of the thing, as it were, about how the West is terrible and it's getting involved everywhere. So the specific fantasies of Mr. Patrushev, Putin wouldn't necessarily buy into, but Patrushev rather does. But the difference is that Patrushev is a more stable and conservative actor than Putin. So even though Patrushev's fantasies are more extreme than Putin's, I don't think Patrushev would have even himself necessarily started a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So that's a kind of interesting paradox. So, but Alina, I'm pessimistic about sincerity here. I think Mr. Putin is way more sincere than people give him credit for in the West, at least, and Mr. Patrushev is way more sincere. That doesn't mean they don't lie. Putin lies all the time, but I mean, is his anti-Western position sincere? Yes. Does he think he got betrayed and outplayed by the West in a completely egregious way? Yes, he does. Does he believe that he somehow uniquely expresses um, the you know authentic historical voice of his people? He thinks things in a direction too. So there's a heck of a lot of sincerity there, I'm afraid. He feels betrayed by Zelensky. He has visceral hatred for Zelensky. Putin does. So this is real stuff. And this has always been a problem with a lot of Western commentators. Oh, he's making it up. Oh, he's made up the NATO story. No, Putin is legitimately, as in legitimately in the sense that it's psychologically real for him. He's genuinely freaked out by NATO. He's freaked out not so much by NATO expansion, but by NATO interventions. There's a great deal of sincerity there. CK, thank you so much. And one of the other things, I mean, I've seen the question in the comments indirectly a couple of times. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? One of the really good things we can do in the West is actually keep our democracies. If we keep our democracies, then we're going to be much more powerful in uh, our attempts to control Mr. Putin. Sirovak is asking me what Russian children will be learning in history classes 20 years from now. It depends on who is in power. Hopefully, they won't be learning Putinist propaganda, which is what is being imposed on them at the moment. HMMM, we lost our democracy with Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Um, I'm not gonna send you the timeout, but just chill out now with the comments. You've said it. You've said a disproportionate amount, so cool off for now. Um, what in truth Iraq did actually was to act as a kind of important stage post into our descent toward post-truth politics. Um, so the manipulations and fabrications around our justifications for the Iraq War played an important role um, in this anyway independently inevitable decline in trust in institutions. But this sped it up. Ase, thank you so much. Tom, thank you so much. Yeah, in terms of moderation, when it's like this, I mean, we're a little bit more messy today in the chat, and I apologize for that. I never monitor anything, and I don't throw people out unless it's a sort of direct physical threat at somebody. Um, but what I would say is that um, comments need to be constructive. Your contribution should not be just to repeat the same thing 35 times, even if you happen to be right, because that just is not conducive to a community conversation. And so, even if nothing you've said is in itself really egregious, um, you know, um, uh, just that kind of reposting of the same point over and over and over just doesn't help conversation. And I normally, when I notice that, I warn people that that's not constructive. I know myself that I'm misbehaving if I go into somebody's YouTube channel and I say, "Wow, what a great video," but I say that 37 times. That's actually spam. Rope access work. We need to prepare for war to keep the peace. Um, I mean, this is the paradox. Do you know who wants peace more than anybody in the world? Ukraine. Um, Nobody is more desperate for peace than Ukrainians, but they don't want a bullshit peace. They want a peace where they are systematically safe from the threat that's come their way. And so the reason Ukraine wants a victory is because they feel that that's the I mean, of course, there's visceral animal-like hatred for all things Russian among many Ukrainians. Is understandable, but they want peace more than anybody else in the world, but they understand that victory is the best way to get it. Alphonse is asking, do the Russians regard the Baltics as their own people the same as they regard Ukraine? No, they don't. They regard the ethnic Russians in the Baltics as their own, but they don't regard all Latvians and Estonians as their own the way they regard Ukrainians. That's the paradox, right? We're not, I mean, we repeat this point many times, they're not engaged in a sort of conventional imperialism in Ukraine, whereby they're saying here an inferior people and we're going to civilize them or colonize them. No, they're saying Ukrainians are just us, same thing. And they're just saying they're Ukrainian because they're suffering from a kind of false consciousness. So no, I think there is a difference. Um, and so when Putin says that Poland is his, he's certainly not thinking that Poles are Russians the way he's thinking Ukrainians are Russians. He just thinks Poland is his. And quite frankly, he can go and stuff himself with that. Um, Timbuk22 is saying the struggle against Putin could be uniting force to rekindle democracy. So this is a great question to discuss, and I'm a pessimist about it. I wish I wasn't. Um, I don't think that if Ukraine wins, kicks out Russia out of Crimea, the Putin regime collapses, Russia becomes whatever it becomes, but it becomes better, whatever happens on that space. I don't think our democracies come out of that better, I'm afraid to say. I think they come out of it the same or worse. I'll talk more perhaps about why I have such a pessimistic view. Um, so evil, William G is saying, is Putin pure evil as you see evil? Um, what Putin is profoundly and extraordinarily um, and destructively politically irresponsible in a way that's costing a lot of lives. Evil is not a character state. It's not a state of the mind. In politics, evil is doing really bad things. And really bad means that you're doing things, A, fairly directly, right? Which have a catastrophic impact on people's lives or even take their lives. And you're doing so unnecessarily. So directly, quite deliberately, unnecessarily, and with catastrophic consequences for human life. Um, we're in the realm of evil when that's being done, but there are levels here, of course. So pure evil, I don't know, but has Putin done um, anything that's comparable to what the Nazis did? No, of course not. Absolutely not. There are levels here. Um, and I said much more eloquently about this in my video on evil on the main channel. The video is too rushed. I speak too quickly in it, but it is one of the best videos on the main channel in my view. Um, Villain, thank you so much. Art McTeagle, I'm afraid you are not quite right that democracies will come out with a bit more backbone and unity, because this is not about us morally inspiring ourselves to do better. If the problem, let me put it this way, if the problem with our democracies were a lack of, if you like, moral energy and lack of spirit, then they would come out better. They would be refreshed by Ukrainian victory comes. But because there are underlying forces there, um, which make democratic decline um, to some extent inevitable, that are not about how hurrah we are pro democracy. It means that's not going to happen. So it's a misunderstanding of the conditions of 21st century modernity to think that such a resuscitation can happen. It's a misplacement of the democratic disorientation. It's much more profound and systemic and to do with global forces, economic forces, technological forces, um, also cultural forces we can't always stop, but we can do a lot to mitigate them, and we will be talking about that. We cannot catastrophize our democracies. Our democracies have a marvelous resilience and stunning resilience. I mean, the political systems we live under in the West are a contender for the greatest thing humans have ever invented. Putin is comparable to Hitler at the very, very end of the 30s. Beyond that, we need to see what Putin does. Jean, great to have you. Thank you. Or Golan is saying, if Ukraine manages to win back territories, Russia spent time building up support in Donetsk and Luhansk. Won't they make it more difficult for Ukrainians and pushing Russia out of the border? So there are lots of complexities that I don't think we should go into now. One of them being, of course, that if Ukraine regains all of its territories, um, it'll also regain resources, maybe even human resources, to fight back against future Russian aggression. Um, but you're saying if Ukraine regains more, it'll have more to defend. Is that right? I think if you're saying that, then the answer is that Ukraine's understanding of a best case scenario outcome for itself is to inflict the most catastrophic defeat possible on the Russians. Um, and they hope that defeat may contain a dramatic kind of regime instability as one of its consequences. And then Ukraine can properly win. Um, so my own assessment, and I don't want to justify it, is that putting Crimea under pressure is the only thing and the best thing that Ukraine can do for its long-term security. But even doing that won't be a guarantee of a fantastic outcome. Um, so the next video on the main channel will be about the counteroffensive. And I hope to discuss that in a much more clearer way then. I'm a bit fuzzy at the moment, but I definitely will be talking about it. Or appreciate you, Keith and Down Under. Hi. Um, Rose Orbs, why isn't Vlad sitting in the garden? Because Vlad's internet would not be fast enough. I'm in East London. Elin Glass is taking over Belarus a viable way out of the Ukraine war. No, or at least it doesn't quite make sense. The trouble is that we've got in Belarus a country that is um, fundamentally, I think, opposed to Mr. Putin's project. It's not a country where there is this kind of unbelievable depoliticization and people don't know where they are. Um, with Belarus, you just need to get rid of the regime and the country will begin moving fairly healthily. The trouble is that the regime that has taken hostage of Belarus has also been itself taken hostage by the Kremlin. And that's why the story of Lukashenko's health is so um, much on people's minds all the time. Yeah, the trouble is that Mr. Putin, if he has the opportunity, will want to have a second round of this war. So how do we obstruct the opportunity, Putin's opportunity to have a second round? Tom, thank you for your time and insight. I hope to hear more about what we can do. I'm really planning content on that. If you want a little bit in the meantime, um, go on YouTube and type in Charles Taylor. Um, Charles Taylor is, in my view, the leading public intellectual in the West. But he is not a public intellectual. He's a public intellectual. He's actually an intellectual. He is one of the two most important living philosophers. Um, and he has been speaking to the culture extensively about democratic degeneration and democratic regeneration in the last 10 years. Ryan, do you have thoughts on China, Russia, if the Kremlin begins to lose control over the country? Would they wait for the dust to settle, or would they somehow take advantage of the situation? So China is interested in um, Charles Taylor, is the philosopher I mentioned. Um, China is interested in a Russia that is strong enough. Bobby, thank you so much. That is strong enough to challenge the West and to be a frustration to the West. Um, China's mission shouldn't be discussed in too much detail for me by me, because I'm absolutely not a country expert, and China suffers, unfortunately, just like Russia did before the war, from a lot of BS expertise on it. So people who have been, to China for a week and have written a couple of articles, I think they're experts. So it's very important to be conservative. But in extremely broad brushstrokes, China is interested in divisions within the West, divisions within the EU, divisions between the EU and the United States, which unobstruct the path for China's rise. Um, China will be a beneficiary of um, Russia experiencing catastrophic problems, but China also wants Russia to be functional enough to be an irritant for the West. So China does not want the Putin regime to fall apart necessarily. Yeah, H triple M, you're bored. Thank you for your contribution. You're bored because you've been told to stop speaking. Who is the second philosopher? Probably Alistair McIntyre. Second great philosopher alive. Jan is saying that if you compare the level of understanding what happens within our society and around the world, in Russia and in the West, is there a gap? Yeah, I think it's complex because the West is in some ways easier. There's bits of the West that are easier to understand than Russia is, which allows Russians to understand the West um, better than we can understand them in some ways. But broadly speaking, I would say that we have very, very, very false views about Russia. But Russians have more false views about us than we have about them, maybe. That's how I judge it. And at the level of politics, things have improved recently, but I would say that the understanding of Russia in Western capitals before the war was really poor, but it was extraordinary compared to the Russians' understanding of us. I mean, when I say that Mr. Patrushev means when he says, I mean, there is a video on the main channel about one of Patrushev's recent um, outbursts. That's the stuff he's thinking. So yes, our understanding is quite poor of Russia. It's improved a lot since the war, but the understanding of the Kremlin the Kremlin has of us is shockingly bad, like catastrophically bad. So, and then if you go more widely into the culture, I think we get Russians wrong a lot. I think they get us wrong even more than we get them wrong. So it's bad all round, but less bad on our part. That's how I'd judge it. Cheryl is saying, watching 1420, it looks like Russians generally don't understand us at all. Now, um, just to say, and I've been repeating this because I know that 1420 is really a channel in our bubble. So a lot of us watch it. It's very important to try to interpret really well what people say there, um, because it's a special kind of ritual they're engaged in when they're speaking to 1420. Um, so um, it it is absolutely not a representation of what's going on in the minds of people who are walking down the street, because it's a special case of people who decide to engage in this weird ritual, which isn't entirely safe actually. So why are they doing that? Um, what does it say about that kind of segment of the population that's going to speak to 1420? Um, it it's obviously much more likely to be people who support the regime, obviously. Um, but I think there are deeper things going on there too. I actually think that there's a little bit of an element of people addressing 1420, even though it's clearly a YouTube channel, as though it were somehow an intermediary between them and the Putin regime. Now, you might think that is completely ridiculous, but Russians absolutely relate like that to other Poles. So I actually think there's a little bit of an element of, I'm going to send a message to Mr. Putin. I'm going to send a message to the regime. Um, so I'm only saying this to give an example of how specially inflected these answers are. And I haven't caught up with many recent videos, but on 1420. But I'm thinking actually of just taking one 1420 video and doing a chat on it on this channel, and to guide you through what is going on and who is saying what and why they're saying it, and how that is misrepresentative or representative of the rest of the population. I think that people are watching 1420 in a very unskilled way, and they're not understanding what they're seeing, I'm afraid to say. Nation, thank you. My health is not amazing at the moment, which is why I'm a bit all over the place here, but I'm doing my best, and I'm very, very happy to be with all of you. Over 1,000 of us. Sorry, Charles Taylor, the philosopher, not Charles Taylor, the dictator. Charles Taylor is a Canadian philosopher in his early 90s. Thank you, Allies Nation. Rick, I'm not sure you need to rewatch. I haven't been on amazing form today. It's just life. Maybe watch next time. Oh, I do think heavy metal. I do think all Russians are responsible for what the Putin regime is doing. They're ethically responsible. So I'm actually myself not fully comfortable with the line. It's not their fault. Well, maybe it's not their fault, but it's their responsibility. This depoliticization crisis that we talk about is in part a moral crisis. It's in part a moral disaster to end up in that situation. About responsibility, there's an essay on the main channel, which mentions Thomas Mann quite a bit, and it's called something like "Why All Russians Are Responsible for Putin's War." I'm familiar with Bernardo Kastrup, but not deeply. Punished battle. How responsible is the West for creating the conditions for Putin to rise um, through the shock doctrine and through the Yeltsin, what we did in the Yeltsin period? I would say very. I think we brought Putin up to a good extent. Um, and this is what some of the Russian opposition get pissed off with us for, because they say we came out in 2014 to protest against the war against Ukraine. And what did you do? You continued ingratiating with the Putin regime. You continued to allow emissaries of the Putin regime to buy mansions all over the place in your countries. You continued to welcome the Putin regime onto every seat at every table. And we were protesting. And now you're having a go at us? Um, and so, yeah, as Western citizens, we're absolutely responsible. The Putin regime is a malicious global network, and we have been propping it up. So, absolutely, the Russian people are responsible, but we have responsibility too. And also the responsibility of misreading um, where this thing, how disastrously the destination of this thing was going was going to look. But I think we can go back quite rightly. We can go back to mistakes we made at handling Russia in the 90s, without any doubt. Um, yeah. So I would say yes, it's a fault for in terms of what I see in the comments under my channel, under Jake Bro's channel, under all the channels in our ecosystem. Um, the the lack of Western citizens taking responsibility for how we allowed this pernicious global network to develop. Um, we need to take more of that responsibility and reflect on it, especially if we get a second round. We've got to deal with another Russia in transition. We've got to not make the same mistakes. Putin is a cult leader. I would imagine Putin becomes a cult leader if the population fascisizes. At the moment, it's a regime trending totalitarian and a population that is still overwhelmingly the standardly depoliticized population that authoritarian states have. Graceful Green, bye bye. Oh my word, we've been doing 2 hours. Let us definitely say that we're done. Let us definitely say that we're done. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with me, and very much look forward to speaking and connecting with you all very, very soon. It's a pleasure to have been with you. Thank you for tolerating me today, not on best form. Lots and lots of love to you all. And sorry, we had a bit more of a Vatnik situation in the comments to some extent. But lots and lots of love. Take really good care. Bye bye for today.